How many of us have ended up in this spot? You open your phone for a quick check, and suddenly an hour vanishes where you have seen hundreds of images and dozens of videos, and yet nothing really is all that memorable and nothing kind of registers. This is the paradox of what is called infinite scrolling, and it's a paradox because in many ways it becomes like a bottomless ocean of so-called content where we paradoxically end up seeing less the more we actually see. So you have some 19th century philosophers, particularly like Friedrich Nietzsche, who warned people about this kind of nihilism. And he warned about this long before the advent of smartphones. Of course, he also told people that God is dead. So ironically, while he might have kind of been on the right path in terms of his reaction to increasingly what would be known as modern life was kind of correct, at the same time he also overreacted himself. The most common form of stupidity, though, that Nietzsche observed is the stupidity of forgetting what one is trying to accomplish, or the stupidity of, losing one's focus along the way of what you set out to do. And again, how many of us have had this experience in this moment that we're in with digital technology, particularly digital handheld screen technology that robs us of our ability to not only focus, but to sustain focus. And you have to kind of admit he was sort of prescient for this digital age that would come. Of course, also I feel like he is a harbinger of that age to come, because again, telling people that God is dead, well, belief in Allah, belief in God, Islam in particular, would be and should be a counter to this. Although, I think we're finding that a great many of us Muslims are caught up on this today. But increasingly, we seem to be getting caught up in the algorithmic riptides. So consider the streaming service paradox, right? This will put it into context for you, or make it even more clear. With thousands and thousands of shows and movies, TV shows, movies, and other things that are available at the click of or swipe of a finger or the click of a button, we, ironically though, sometimes seem to spend the same amount of time trying to find something to watch, maybe even more time spent trying to find something to watch than actually watching what it is we want to watch itself. And I've been going through this actually with my parents lately, who ironically, my parents are in their 80s and they're in their 90s. So they're definitely from another time and another generation, perhaps a generation or two. And they're from a time in which, when you wanted to watch TV, it was to watch whatever was offered. And so now that my parents are living with me, I've had to watch a lot more television than I'm accustomed to, because I've never had broadcast cable in my life as an adult, living on my own. But, I got that for my parents to, make them comfortable, because that's what they were accustomed to doing. And yet my mom in particular gets frustrated because she's, I'll ask her, okay, Mom, what do you want me to put on the TV for? Because she's not good at working the remote. She's not good at figuring out how to, bring up what to watch. And she'll say, well, there's nothing on. And I said, well, Mom, actually everything is on. So then we'll spend time going through everything that is on. And I see where that just avalanche of potential choices is overwhelming for my mother. And so we spend a lot of time getting, caught up in the kind of currents and the riptides of algorithms. And yet, ironically, can't seem to find anything that she wants to watch. So that's that paradox of spending more time browsing than actually watching. And then at the end, and I see this with my mom especially, is that she often ends up just simply settling, right? Almost like the fatigue of finding something. And also, if I can be honest, and I love my mom, I love my parents, but I think also they have lost the muscle. They've lost the skill and even the intuition, I would say, of finding something that you want to watch, which is even more crucial today, where in times before, there might have only been like 4 or 5 channels, at least back when you had a TV that had the 2 dials on it. You had the top dial and the bottom dial. And, there might be like a handful of channels that you could get, especially back in the times of reception, where before even cable. And that's most certainly the time that my parents come from. And so it didn't fatigue them trying to find something because there wasn't that much to look at. And therefore, you could, I think, much easier have a sense of contentment about whatever was going to be presented for you. Where now, that process is actually fatiguing for them. I see that they get completely overwhelmed, and they just kind of, and sometimes literally sigh and sit back in the chair and go, okay, well, we'll just settle for whatever is there, rather than them expending the effort or even, again, having the disposition to find something that truly interests them. And I think that's where a lot of us are at today. If certain parts of the world, and very much so, struggle with scarcity, I think that our challenge is abundance. Because abundance, particularly in the way that it manifests here, is that it creates a lot of decision fatigue. And so our minds are often overwhelmed by choice. And the result is a kind of surrendering to whatever requires the least resistance. So you'll just watch this, or you'll just doom scroll that, because in some ways that's the path of least resistance. And we've all experienced this, maybe having gone to a supermarket versus, say, like a market. You go to a supermarket and you almost feel like there's these infinite aisles. Like, I've experienced this myself, especially if you ever travel. If you travel and you go somewhere, and I don't like to, like, when I travel and I stay in a hotel, I'm a person that eats, the food that I cook, or rather, I cook predominantly, the food that I eat, I predominantly cook myself. And so when I travel, I like to maintain that. I don't like eating out a lot because, I have some health needs, and also just, I would say, I also have health aspirations of how I want to eat, and I like to do that even when I'm traveling. And so instead of just going and eating fast food or takeout, I'll go to a store and buy some stuff so I can have have what I want. But when you go to a store where, in a place where you don't normally live, sometimes, you go in there and like, where is everything? You can't find anything. And you start having to ask somebody, well, I was trying to find this on that aisle, and so on. And so the abundance of decisions, it just creates, again, almost like a paralysis. And I think that's where some people are at today. I think people are paralyzed by too many choices, especially choices that don't really result in anything that is satisfying. So having everything makes us less likely to actually choose anything deliberate. And this shouldn't be thought of something only in the context of some type of, concocted digital minimalism. Because as a Muslim, and as Muslims, a lot of what we do are deliberate choices. And so I'm probably repeating myself. I know I've said this several times, but you take, for instance, somebody that is born in a Muslim family. How often have we, as those who are not born Muslim, how often have we heard the trope, oh, mashallah, you chose Islam and you did this and that. And I just heard this from somebody not less than, or rather not more than a week ago. And it was right after khutbah, and the person came up, oh, mashallah, your khutbah was great, and blah, 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 blah. And, mashallah, you chose Islam. I'm like, what, you ain't choosing Islam right now either? Oh, but it's different. How's it different? You came to Jum'ah. Allah said, فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ وَذَرُوا الْبَيْعَ. Allah, God gave the command, go to the Friday prayer. Rush and go to the remembrance of God, go to the remembrance of Allah, and leave off worldly things. So, you mean to tell me that you did this out of no choice, but I'm doing it out of a choice? This is ridiculous. We're all, when we're hopefully doing things as Muslims, we're doing them deliberately. And so, being deliberate is a very important part of our Islam, though we may not always conceive of it in that way. And in fact, I think this is what leads to the kind of cultural Islam, right? Which I think on one hand, obviously, wherever Muslims go, they will create a culture that's influenced and inspired by Islam. So that isn't the problem. But I think what's really meant by cultural Islam is a kind of passivity, if that's a word, right? Just being, a passive consumer, or in the case of Islam, a passive practitioner of Islam, where not a lot of thought is really, not a lot of thought, a lot of passion is really invoked in making active selections of things that we will do. And again, I think this is something that can be as, mundane as choosing something, entertainment, what we're going to watch or something. But also, I think it can be, really, foundational. Like, are we not actively selecting to do things? And so, without the right kind of framework without the right framework to put all of this, in a context that's meaningful for us, then I think we're going to have we'll continue to have the death and the attrition of meaning and the meaningful. And so there's a quote, and it's not quite who it's attributed to, but it's interesting, that says, "He who cannot obey himself will be commanded." And in some ways, this is kind of similar to the verse in the Quran where Allah says, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهُهُ هَوَاهُ وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ. And so this is very similar to the passage in the Quran where Allah Ta'ala says that, have you not seen the one that takes his hawa as his God, as his object of worship? That, in a sense, what will command him to do, this or that. So by being decisive and actively being able to direct our focus, this is critical, as we said, for Islamic and non-Islamic things, for all of life, for our religious life, for even our dunyawi life, for our worldly life. This is extremely important. And again, not to I don't want to over-invoke him, but Nietzsche did warn that without self-imposed boundaries, we become servants to algorithms. And I'm using him because, instead of quoting some classical scholar, because just in case for any non-Muslims that are listening, that, of course, the people that we really put the most stock in, well, first will be whatever God says in the Quran. Secondly, whatever is authentically attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. may Allah bless him. Third, to the companions of the Prophet and the righteous after them, sort of in that order. But for the sake of this conversation, I want to show that even a person of a thoroughly Western persuasion and origin looked around him and said, something is not right about all this. So, Nietzsche warned that without self-imposed boundaries, we will become servants to passions and worldly things, which would ultimately say that we will become servants to algorithms. And we have to understand, like, these algorithms are designed to maximize our attention, or maximize to grab our attention and to divert it from other things, and most certainly not to our fulfillment. And so one practical exercise you can do would be to, again, focus on intention, because we know that's a big thing in Islam, is our intention for things. So, for instance, like before opening any app, whether that's going to be Instagram, Google Docs, email, whatever, take out a sheet of paper and write down, just jot down, what is it that you're trying to get? And just be honest. I don't know. I just want to see what's going on in the world. I just want to see some funny videos. I want to see if I got that email from this or that. Because what's the intention behind it? So write down exactly what is it that you're seeking, and then also write down how long do you think, or how long are you willing to expend? So, okay, before I do it, what am I trying to get from this phone, from this app? And then how long am I willing to partition some time? Okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to spend 30 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour, whatever, versus an open-ended kind of blank check. Then after that, ask the question, did I accomplish what I intended? So if I intended to watch, I don't know, whatever that it was, or check whatever that it was, then add a level of accountability to the intentionality. Did I accomplish that? Did I accomplish actually what I set out and intended to do? So this puts a kind of conscious limitation on our action. Now, on one hand, this might be seen as restricting your freedom, but actually, you will actually reclaim more of your freedom if you put a conscious restriction on it. At least that's just my opinion. I don't know, something to consider, to try out. And so, as I said, a lot of our Islam is about choices, intentional, directed choices. And so that's something we should see as, that's, the conversation around things like free will. I don't like a lot of the typical, traditional, theological discussions around it, because I feel like, I don't know, I just don't like the way that they're framed. I think a positive way to consider is that Allah has given us a power of choice, not always a power of fulfillment, because I might want to make a choice, but I may desire to do it, but I will not be able to fulfill it. And that's something that Allah speaks about, that the Quran also talks about, وَمَا يَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. And you will not even be able to, desire to do a thing unless God allows you to do that. That being said, if God does give us the license and the agency for choice, then wouldn't then the real power of choice not be in having infinite options, which is in many ways a squandering of that blessing of agency to be able to do things, but rather having the the irada, the will to actually select something meaningful from amongst all of those. And so we have to be discerning and selective. So I also don't like I don't like the word freedom, and then the discussions around it, because I also feel it's just kind of like a weird word. But perhaps real freedom is not when we scroll for forever, but also maybe when we choose not to, because scrolling in and of itself, as we go back and ask that question, what did I get from it? What did I get from my scrolling? So, again, how many of us are like this? You wake up, you reach for your phone, you open an app that's allegedly personalized for you. And this will feel like freedom, but in many ways it just turns out to be a very carefully designed cage from the moment you wake up to keep you in a certain lane and to direct your attention. Of course, now this definitely is sounding very, very shaitanic, as it should. These algorithms that power this digital world that we live in they're not merely just suggesting content. They're also architecting the very possibilities of what we will like, and even architecting our desires with each click, because every time we click on something, swipe on something, or don't swipe on something, it's recording that information and then feeding it back to us in a way based upon the objectives of whoever is ultimately the architect on the other side of that. So every click, every non-click, every pause, every lingering gaze, all of that is calculated and quietly re-architected into the next round of click and pause and gaze to ensure that we are playing the game. They're definitely building these models to construct another version of yourself, not the version of yourself that Allah Ta'ala wants you to be, not the kind of person you would be if you were actually emulating the Prophet ﷺ or actually following in the footsteps of the companions and of the Salaf and of the early great Muslims. No, but rather they're building a model of you, of who they think you are and what they would rather you become versus what I just mentioned. And so this kind of goes back to, again, the Nietzschean, quote, beware that when fighting monsters you don't become one yourself. And of course, many of us will be familiar with the idea of when you gaze into the abyss, the abyss also gazes back to you. Of course, now the abyss is, an algorithm. And that abyss is not just simply staring back at you. It's reflecting something back at you, but I would not say not only it's not only not your authentic self, because, what is that? But more importantly, whatever aspirations or potential you had to become something that Allah Ta'ala would be pleased with, that would be good for you hereafter, it's instead going to reflect back a simplified and also marketable version of yourself. So those things that do not relate to a spreadsheet, that don't relate to marketing, then in many ways those things will be de-emphasized. So it's not going to, it's not going to market you those things that are going to get you to Jannah. It's going to market you those things that will get at your bank account. It's definitely a kind of a shrinking mental universe, so much that we can end up being trapped in a kind of herd mentality. And we see this now on social media, where people like Elon Musk and their buying of Twitter, you might say, why would he buy Twitter? Well, clearly if you had the aspirations and the ambitions of Elon Musk, which was to make his foray into government and having control over society, what better way to help foster that than to take a quasi-public utility like Twitter, which has a massive following, and under the guise of free speech, shape it and foment discord and anger and disenfranchisement and disillusionment and all those other things, to where it now herds a great number of people into a direction that is convenient for your Musk's ambitions. And this is very different today, where people's attitudes and ideas are no longer being shaped in a so-called marketplace of ideas, but they're being manipulated in these online, almost like a kind of factory farming version of a marketplace. And whether we want to talk about it being halal and haram, I'm just hearkening back to what it was like when I was a kid, that, if you wanted to, one of the ways that you found out about music as a kid was like through your friends, so actual human interaction, maybe some older siblings. And then, of course, when you were old enough, you could go to the record store. And the record store was this really interesting thing, because you would, or even something perhaps a bit more neutral like comics, right? I mean, you would go to the comic store or the music store and you would just peruse the aisles. You would go through these aisles and you would get exposed to different types of music and different artists and different comics and whatnot, in a way now that the only way that people today will get exposed to those is through an algorithm. And what's funny is that everything that is recommended to a person today, what they perceive as new, they're actually just receiving these recommendations by their own past preferences. So it's almost like they're being intravenously fed their own waste product. Ugh. And so in our time and our age, I feel like the truly novel kind of perspective shifting encounters, like in a bookstore, a comic shop, a record store, are becoming increasingly rare, if almost entirely not at all. The other thing too is that these algorithms, while they definitely want to manipulate you, they don't necessarily want to challenge you. It actually wants to coddle you and satisfy you just enough to keep you going to the next swipe and going to the next engagement, but not that you will ever grow, and most certainly not that you would ever grow and be independent of that content and of that algorithm. And so I think what would be helpful today, and I know a few, people like Sheikh Joe and whatnot, he calls it like a social media hiatus. I think actually now we should be calling for algorithmic sabbaticals. And I think this would be especially important. I work as an imam full-time. That's my full-time job, is I work at Middle Ground as an imam. And being an imam today is very different than it was 30, 40 years ago, let alone before that. In that now part of your job is like being this social media person, like having a presence on social media and posting videos and whatnot. And so the laity are exposed to this, but also, the learned people are. And I think that just like in academia, once a person reaches a certain position, like a tenured professor, if your job is to, produce scholarship, which is kind of like a big umbrella, right? Within scholarship, you have teaching and you have research and whatnot. And so, you will go on sabbatical. And when you go on sabbatical, you're not just like, kicking up your feet, right? But it gives you time away to go focus so that you can, maybe write a new book or research something or whatever that it is. And I think that we could use some algorithmic sabbaticals today, and especially for imams and scholars, but also for just regular Joe Muslims. Maybe like one day each week, just don't consume anything online. I'm not saying you can't answer your phone, if you have a phone call, or if you're working, but I think consuming content, take a sabbatical. And instead, again, just so this doesn't become some type of like digital minimalism, like it doesn't become the equivalent of like matcha or avocado toast, right? That don't settle for only the subtractive. So the subtractive is, okay, I'll consume nothing. But the additive is, interact with another human being, whether that be your children, your spouse, a friend, or even just, like go to a bookstore, go somewhere, a coffee shop, interact with somebody, even if it's a stranger or whatnot, and, try to have a real human. So one part subtractive, one part additive. So that way we kind of like, we live a life outside the funnel. Brother Dawood will laugh at that reference, the funnel. So even though I don't like the term freedom, but I think it's important to remember that true freedom is not going to be found, again, in infinite scrolling, but much closer to the power and the will to define yourself beyond what is being, I think, presented to you and predicted for you. We definitely need to reclaim some sense of ourselves beyond that. So picture your phone at the end of a long day. You've scrolled through hundreds of posts, you've watched dozens of videos, consumed countless, opinions from people, and then ask yourself, well, what remained of all that? What mattered and what didn't matter? In fact, I think what mattered, you'll find by default, none of it mattered. And by default, none of it remained. You probably can't remember a damn thing from it. And I think then if we are going to be people that are going to operate in that space, we need to start, again, having some intentionality and asking those questions. Shouldn't something remain? After all, and I'll just say this for myself, if I'm going to go make all these damn videos and podcasts and put it up, and nothing remains, nothing sticks other than, all right, well, what's next? Swipe, whatever, then it's kind of ridiculous. Maybe I should go do something else if you are not going to appreciate or learn from it. And this is not about me. I'm saying all of it. What remained and what mattered. Because in this kind of transient digital age, we've created this kind of paradoxical void. It's like an endless stream of content, but nothing sticks. Nothing really seems to register. And again, this is the kind of nihilism that Nietzsche warned about. It's a dangerous moment when nothing means anything anymore. And indeed, I would add that it's when everything means nothing, especially every provided thing. Now, things that are provided for you by Allah and things that you provide by your own intention and your own sweat equity, your own curiosity, that's different. But what we have, this issue where, nothing, everything means nothing anymore. It's kind of like a sort of, think of social media and these devices as a kind of curated attrition. That's how I see it. So now we kind of have, almost to update it, we have like a digital nihilism. And I feel like in digital nihilism, everything is served with equal weight. Now, what do I mean by that? So we've all seen this. You're on YouTube and you'll have a video discussing a global crisis, and right next to it sits a video about a cat. Profound wisdom sits right alongside mindless pranks. And here's the thing, right? The algorithm doesn't discriminate. It merely feeds But if you do react to it, right, if you're willing yourself to make little of a global crisis or to make that of equal weight, so you click on the global crisis and you click on the cat video, then the algorithm will continue to feed the two of these to you, but all the while it's conditioning you to not see that big of a difference between the two. So think of it like, you're like this gigantic banquet table. Now, traditionally, you'd be, in a banquet, traditionally, people were very careful about like what dishes they were selected, where they would be placed, the glasses, the cups, the fork, the spoon, and then you would actually savor every bite as well as the broader experience of going to a banquet. And then you'd want to digest that and whatnot. But now we're just force-fed and like an infinite buffet, which is very different than a banquet, to where nothing is properly seasoned, cooked, and therefore nothing is properly tasted because it's also not really worthwhile spending a lot of time as to whether or not it's tasty, and we just move on to the next so-called morsel. I think another thing that Nietzsche was right about was that, the essence of nihilism is that one either comes to not believe in any values or one's value senses become stunted and desensitized. An example of this, and we're all guilty of it, watch somebody at a restaurant that's, somebody made this amazing meal, and they start taking photos of it immediately instead of actually experiencing the food. Except now, that's with all information, not just, food. So our modus operandi nowadays is document, share, and move on. Never really be fully present and never ever deeply engage in anything. And I think this attitude has penetrated our masajid. People go to masajid, they check in, they take a photo, they share it, and then they move on. They're not somebody that really goes and is really fully present at the masjid. They don't attend the classes. They're never really learning anything, and they're never deeply engaged. But you will find them online arguing about nonsense. So, like a lot of the food today, this content, it sort of passes through us, but without any nourishment. And so digital nihilism, it kind of creates the illusion of being informed and the illusion of being nourished by this content, while it actually leaves us quite empty. It also leaves us, and this is, as we say, a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. I think it leaves us with a little bit of knowledge about everything, but we understand almost nothing. We have no big picture anymore. And that has created a kind of person, and this is no longer just talking about Muslims, this is just in general, that react without reflection. We consume without contemplating or discernment. So what do we do? What's the way forward? I think we have to create sanctuaries and sanctuaries of meaning, sanctuaries of attention, sanctuaries of genuine, intimate, human intimacy. And I think that's one of the ways forward. I think that's what our masajid should be. Individually, collectively, I think we should designate specific times where we engage deeply with some limited content, right? Just going to Jumu'ah once a week is not sufficient. And I think, and I've spoken about the TED Talkification of the mimbar before, where I feel like khutbahs are often reduced to a sort of TED Talk inspirational thing. Along with the fact that most of them, increasingly our masajid do not have full-time imams or somebody there that's full-time, and so you have a different person every week that typically has no training, and their idea of a khutbah is a TED talk or motivational speech or just rambling. And so there's no deep engagement of limited things. I know, and when I say limited, like, let's read a book. Like right now we're reading Sheikh Dr. Al-Khuraydi's Al-Aqa'id Al-Thamanuna fi Shahadat al-Islam, right? The 80 principles of creed and belief extracted from the 2 declarations of faith. And the book is like, I don't know, 130 pages long. But inshallah, we'll try to read through the whole thing. So that's what I mean by, like, stick with one thing. That's what I mean by limited content, but you do a deep dive through it. But that requires you to be willing to show up and be committed. So, perhaps it's one book or a longer article. Perhaps it's having meaningful conversations. But we have to push back on this. We have to kind of rediscover what it means to really fully metabolize ideas rather than just merely sampling them. And this is where, this is where I will reveal my true snobbery. I have appreciation for hip hop to a very limited extent as an art form. And there are some people that are really gifted. That being said, I'm a person that comes from a real musical background, studying jazz, music theory. And there's a big difference between sampling a riff and turning that into, something kind of interesting versus fully metabolizing how to actually play an instrument, fully metabolizing music theory, fully metabolizing, melodic and harmonic ideas. And I'm just using this as an example because we need to do the same thing with our tradition, with Islam, with many things in our life. We need to truly rediscover what it means to fully metabolize things versus merely sampling them. Because when everything means nothing, then you could say, people want to always have some sort of revolution, right? Well, the revolutionary act today would be that when everything means nothing, then the revolutionary act is to make something mean everything. Like, make your Islam mean everything. How to start? Well, maybe even for just 1 hour. Impose those boundaries that we've talked about thus far. Impose them upon yourself. I mean, this is, and again, just for the sake of this podcast, I have no romantic notions about Nietzsche whatsoever. Because again, this is the person that God is dead. And yet, he did seem to have a sort of like presage about the stuff that would come. And he's the one that has the phrase, and my German isn't great, but he said, "Der Wille zur Macht," right? The will to power. Impose boundaries on yourself. Have some willpower. And part of willpower is actually habitual. Willpower is not just simply power, but it is also culminated through habit, which is why Islam is such a habitual way of life, a so-called habitual religion. And that power should be, that we cultivate, inshallah, is not over others, but over our own conscious, over our own nafs, over our own soul, to where we could, willfully ask the question, is every time I'm opening my phone, am I making choices or am I surrendering my choices? If every time I open my phone, am I making a choice or am I surrendering to some algorithm's beckoning call? Right? And remembering that the algorithm doesn't feed me content. The algorithm doesn't feed you content that serves your best version of yourself. It's serving you content according to, right, it's what its priorities are. And we have to be hungry. We have to be, as Muslims in particular, we need to be hungry for Islam. Because these algorithms are hungry for our attention. And they're always on the hunt. So, yeah, definitely, that sounds more like a digital cage. And so, this is kind of like the unseen in some ways. So like it's a kind of an invisible hand that is an extension of some great recommendation engine behind a curtain that we can't see that will just keep us scrolling ad infinitum. And so what Nietzsche was talking about in his will to power isn't about consuming whatever happens to flow your way, but it's the strength to resist the current and be deliberate about the direction that you want to go. It's also to say enough when you see everyone else around you just gorging. It's to say enough. We already know of the prophetic advice that the Prophet Muhammad, may Allah bless him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said, وَالثُّلُث لِلْأَقَلِ وَالنَّفَسِ وَالشَّرَبِ, right? That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam recommended that if we were to proverbially portion up our stomach, to leave a third for food, drink, and breath, each of those having a third. So, when is enough enough? Or will you just keep gorging on more of this content? Choose what actually truthfully deserves your energy, your passion, than just just resigning to let the algorithm decide what is your passions. So ask this question, or consider this question. Is a person who can close YouTube after watching just one video, is that person, are they or are they not more free than someone who watches 10? Like how many of us it's like the old Lay's potato chip commercial. You can't eat only one. You can't watch just one, right? Or a person who selects one book deliberately and reads it, even if it comes with expending great effort, because our capacity for attention has been decimated. Is that not better? And does that person not possess more agency than the one who has a massive digital library? They're drowning in it, but yet they never finish a single book. So this is going to challenge us to become who we ought to be, and not just simply resigning ourselves for what the algorithms want us to be. And so this requires courage, something we also don't talk about enough as Muslims, like courage. And here's the thing about Islam and about Iman and even Ihsan, right? Those three mighty principles in Islam, right? Islam is submission, and Iman is belief in God, being faithful, and Ihsan is like dutiful worship. So ask yourself, to accomplish those, do you have the courage to impose meaningful limits on yourself, or no? So maybe another experiment. Try this for a week or a couple days. Choose all of the digital content that you're going to watch. Choose it in advance. Write down what it is you would actually like to see on Instagram or YouTube. And there's a big difference, especially for Instagram. it's probably going to be even harder. But write down what you'll watch or read before opening up any of the apps. And then stick to only those selections and see what happens. No clicking on any suggested videos and no infinite scrolling. And again, this is not about a kind of digital minimalism, because that's merely the subtractive part that I mentioned. But reclaiming your ability to focus, reclaiming your attention, reclaiming your passion, reclaiming your will, that's the attitude. Imagine like an artist. My oldest brother is a comic book artist, animator, very talented. And so all my life I've grown up around art. My middle brother is a professional musician. But take an illustrator, for instance. Does an illustrator work with a blank canvas? Yes, they do. But is it an infinite blank canvas? No. It usually is, 8.5 by 11 or whatever that it is. But it's not an infinite canvas. It has actual edges and boundaries. And of course, all of this popular psychology and philosophy, about having no restrictions, this is ridiculous. Every great artist that ever drew anything, that ever sculpted anything, that ever composed anything, were never restricted by the borders. Those borders are actually what made creation of these artistic pieces and their creativity possible to manifest. So we've been told this and sold a particular fantasy that unlimited choice equals freedom and that we need to live unrestricted, boundless lives. This is horse doo-doo. All this has resulted in is the creating of a technology that would embody that to the absurd ends of endless scrolling and to consume infinitely without any form of nourishment. Right? Choosing from millions of options, but never deciding on any one of them or none of them being satisfactory. Right? Look closely at your own nafs, at your own qalb, at your mind, your heart, after just an hour of scrolling, and ask yourself, has this expanded or contracted my chest or my heart? And it's interesting. I would say that Islam as a guiding system and the Prophet ﷺ as its exemplar have shown us that the most so-called spiritual of beings, the Anbiya, the prophets, the Salihun, right, the righteous, they find their happiness where others find their destruction. How many of us find our happiness in not drinking and not gambling and not usury and not war and not... Think about that. Finding your happiness where others find their destruction. How many great artists, right, to look at how many great artists from the secular point of view wound up committing suicide, dying of addiction, drug overdoses, misery, and creating a lot of misery around them. Nonetheless, though, there is something about having boundaries, right? The constraints that appear to often limit us become the very conditions for our artistic and creative liberation, if you will. Right? So, again, I come from a jazz musical background. So consider the jazz musician. Does he or she find boundless expression within the rigid structure of chord progressions or time meters? No. So you could take like a 2-5-1 chord progression. You could take a blues. You could take a 4/4 time signature. How many amazing songs and solos and other things have been done within those boundaries and those rigid structures of melodic minor and half diminished and blah, blah, blah. Like, those are all structures, very rigid structures. And yet, we seem to have, as the audience, we seem to have no fatigue in our consumption of artistic expressions that they give the illusion of breaking those structures, but they don't, because if they broke them entirely, we wouldn't be able to relate to them. But within those structures, they create beauty, creativity, imagination. So creativity isn't diminished by constraints. It's actually ignited by them. And we should think about that no different in the constraints that Islam places upon us. They are a mercy from Allah and a gift. Both of those. They are a mercy and a gift that Allah Ta'ala has placed boundaries on us. But meanwhile, we find ourselves paralyzed before infinite digital buffets, experiencing a kind of almost choice overload. Because when everything is possible, nothing feels significant, right? When every sexual partner becomes possible, there's no love. This is why people today are, as zina, as fornication has spread and become rampant and celebrated and become the norm, people increasingly feel, and not just the people that are participating in it, but everyone, their children, the people that are the byproducts of it, they feel insignificant. When anything can be consumed, nothing is really savored. That's why, the cuisine of the Muslim world is some of the most astounding cuisine that has no alcohol whatsoever. So, what are we going to do with all these algorithmic illusions that create infinite choice, that in actuality narrow the channeling of our attention, of our creativity, of our gifts? What happens when you deliberately limit your inputs? When you choose 5 books to read deeply instead of, skimming 50 articles. And boy, if people were actually skimming 50 articles, that would be amazing. But imagine just deliberately reading 5 books versus doom scroll. Or imagine to choose and watch one documentary and to contemplate what was being presented to you instead of watching, just 10 podcasts, and I'm guilty here, right? 10 podcasts or 10 reels. Your mind and your heart can expand into the depth that infinite breadth kind of, prohibits. So the path to freedom then, and I'm not comfortable with that word, begins not with more choices, but actually with not only better boundaries, but a veneration of those boundaries and a consideration of those boundaries and an appreciation of those boundaries. How many of us would prefer to go to a buffet versus, a restaurant where the chef is renowned and the food is, and I'm not talking about sophisticated, that's different, but I'm saying truthfully, there is a chef that is renowned that makes incredible food. Would you rather go there to a buffet with 1,000 different mediocre dishes? That's a different kind of viewpoint. And so don't make yourself ripe for harvest for these algorithms. And again, I'm gonna dare to. My German is not what it used to be, but Nietzsche said, "Der Mensch ist etwas, das überwunden werden soll." Right? Man is something that shall be overcome. And I think what he was talking about in the future, and we see this now with AI and the whole kind of futurist and the singularity and all that kind of stuff, is that the human is something to be overcome and to be conquered. Not in the way of فألهمها فجورها وتقواها قد أفلح من زكاها وقد خاب من دساها. Not in the idea that we should conquer our nafs, but rather, the human being will increasingly become seen as a problem. And therefore, we are increasingly treated as something to overcome and something to manage. So, we've got to really think about we need a fiqh, right? We need a fiqh of technology. I know there was a brother years ago that had the sort of fiqh of social media, but I think actually more broadly we need a fiqh of technology. We in this digital context, this will require developing a kind of higher consciousness about our attention and where do we direct it, becoming the masters of what we consume rather than its servant. And the reason why I'm saying we need a fiqh of it, because just as we have a fiqh of akal, right? We have fiqh of ta'am. We have fiqh of food. What food is permissible, what food is not permissible. We have fiqh of ibadah. We have fiqh of worship. What kinds of worship is permissible, what kind is not permissible. And so we need the same thing so that we become the muhsin of ibadah. We become the one who is excellent in their ibadah. Maybe this was Nietzsche really like a closet Muslim? Maybe that's what he meant by the Ubermensch, was the muhsin. I don't know. I'm just I'm just speculating here. But remember, in a world that is increasingly designed to capture your attention, consciously directing it elsewhere, and specifically to Allah Ta'ala, is probably one of the greatest acts of freedom and satisfactory things that we can do. So it's kind of like, again, maybe instead of like digital minimalism, we need a sort of digital aestheticism. Digital zuhud, which isn't about having a sort of self-flagellating attitude towards it, but definitely never being comfortable with it. So again, when everyone around you is gorging on endless content, right, the tazahud attitude, the zahid attitude is to fast, right? You could say in some ways, like if everyone around you is gorging endlessly, then like the real revolutionary act is to be the sa'im, is to fast. Having moments of siyam from this technology, especially the screen technology. And it's been said, and it's not attributed 100%, it's not accurate in its attribution to him, but it's worthy of consideration that, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Meaning that if you know why you live, you can deal with almost any situation. So, if the robots are going to take over AI, whatever, if you know why you're here, and that why is not informed by algorithms, but is informed by revelation, sunnah, prophetic things, right, then you'll be able to bear almost anyhow. But it's almost like we've inverted this. We've surrendered our why to platforms. And one sign that maybe the wool is definitely being pulled over our eyes is that, let's consider this another paradox. Your so-called smart device, right? It offers more options than any human in history before us could have even imagined. Yet our thoughts and our behaviors grow increasingly predictable and uniform. Why? Because it's slowly narrowing us in the feed trough. Like we're slowly, like we're just being prepped like lambs for the slaughter. At least that's kind of how I feel about it. So rather than expanding, our mental landscape, so to speak, this illusion of infinite choice is really shrinking the ground underneath our feet. And so, self-mastery is, something truthfully really important for us. So yeah, think about or consider, consider that, the design of your phone. Consider the use of your phone, right? Consider your use of all of this. Is it something that's going to make you more like the Prophet ﷺ, more like the Sahaba? Is it going to help you get to Jannah? Will TikTok, or rather, if those questions are posed, and we presume that yes, I would like to accomplish those goals, then ask yourself, would TikTok then still be on your home screen? Would notifications, not only interrupt your prayer, but the prayer of others when you go to the masjid? So we need to create a set of Islamic principles for engaging with this. And those principles need to say, before we can talk about whatever the contents of what those are, but I'm just saying, kind of like a byline, this is my why. This is what matters. Everything else is negotiable. Right? So what matters is that I become a better Muslim. I become more beloved to Allah. I become closer in my emulation of the Prophet ﷺ. I become more like the Sahaba. And this is my why. This is why I exist. And this is what really matters. And everything else is negotiable. That's what we need, a kind of, And I would say that along with anything, right, start with the 3 major principles in Islam that should inform our values as Muslims. Islam, Iman, Ihsan, submission to God, being faithful to God, and being masterful in our worship of God. And then apply that to this idea of some, Islamic principles as it relates to engaging with technology. Because while Allah Ta'ala definitely prescribes what our values ought to be, only we can actually decide to prioritize them in our life and work towards, actualizing them. Today's algorithmic recommendations, they may be very sophisticated, but they're just sophisticated traps. They don't expand our horizons, and they become actually like echo chambers. And again, that's very much like what Twitter has become today, so-called X. Like Elon has created an echo chamber. But Islam and the Quran and the prophetic Sunnah create a resonance chamber. How do these two differ, right? An echo chamber, it amplifies our own voices. And it often produces a kind of cacophony, noise. Where the Quran, it functions more like a resonance chamber, right? It penetrates the dhulumat, it penetrates the darkness of this world, the darkness of our hearts, of our fears, of our inadequacies. And it not only reshapes us, but it also, it leaves us able to resonate with the world and those around us. So Islam is a resonance chamber, and this other technology is more like an echo chamber. But remember, when you said your shahada, you pledged to surrender yourself to God, right? When we made our shahada, la ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, we pledged to surrender to no one but God. But it seems like increasingly we are surrendering to the algorithms. Algorithms which only serve variations of what we've already consumed. Like I said, it's like we're gorging on the reclaimed waste of our own nafs, of our own desires. And this is almost like the still suit from Dune, right? Which recycles, the bodily waste and then filters out the nasty parts, and so that you can have water to drink, right? Except that this still suit, it's not entirely filtering out the waste. Instead we're being fed it intravenously. And so this results in a kind of very profound impoverishment of experience. One that is masquerading as convenience. So, as we wrap up, ask yourself, when was the last time you actually encountered something truly unexpected online? Something that wasn't, predicted or calculated based upon your previous behavior. Because these moments are becoming increasingly rare, because these prediction engines are designed to eliminate surprise. They want to provoke you. They want to stimulate your desires, but they're not really trying to pique your imagination. And here's another saying that is attributed to Nietzsche, but again, it's somewhat questionable. Somebody might have been paraphrasing, in which it said, right, the individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. And our tribe today is this algorithmic, armada. So we're going to have to really struggle to keep a sense of self from not being overwhelmed by them. So I've made my suggestions. You can go back through and review them, and I'll put up some notes here in the Substack. And give some of this some thought, because we need some serendipity, we need some genuine surprise in our life, some pleasure that isn't just force-fed to us. Because serendipity isn't just like a pleasant accident. It's actually something that's really essential nourishment for the soul. Because we're designed to respond to novelty. What we're being given is the illusion of novelty, especially if we're going to, keep our imaginations robust and healthy. So, inshallah, we work to reclaiming it. We can recover not just we can not just find new discoveries, but a renewed capacity to actually really be truly astonished by the world that Allah Ta'ala has so perfectly created, and what Allah describes as rahba, awe. Because Allah created all of this as an ayah. He created it as a sign.